When the rusted hinges of the merchant's trust vault were finally forced open in 2004, the air that escaped was not just stale, it was dead. For 51 years, the reinforced steel door, welded shut from the outside, had guarded a secret in the flooded black water of the bank's sub-basement. The demolition crew expected rats and ruin. They found a tomb. Chained to the submerged handle of a leather briefcase was a skeleton, its bones stained a dark mahogany by the silt and iron. The man had been tall. The briefcase was empty, and wedged in the skull's upper jaw was a single pristine gold filling. The Chicago press erupted. This had to be him. This had to be the final grisly chapter in the city's most enduring cold case, the disappearance of Arthur Silas Petrov, the mob accountant who vanished in 1953 with the outfit's entire operating fortune. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Arthur Petrov was a ghost, a man of numbers and shadows, meticulous to the point of invisibility. He was not a man of violence, yet here was a violent end. He was a genius of logistics, a man who could move $1 million across the country with 3 phone calls and a ledger entry, yet he was found chained in a trap of his own making. How could the smartest man in the Chicago outfit, the man who held all their secrets, end up here? How did the man who vanished with the family's fortune die with an empty briefcase? To understand the ghost in the vault, to unravel the story of a man who stole the devil's gold, we must go back. We must go back to the freezing, paranoid winter of 1953, when the city was the absolute territory of one man, and Arthur Petrov was, by all accounts, his most trusted servant. His name was Tony the Quarry Ricca. He was not a subtle man. He had earned his name not for his intellect, but for his method. He believed that problems, like stones, should be broken down into smaller, more manageable pieces, and then buried. The outfit in 1953 was a sprawling, brutal enterprise, and Ricca sat at its head, a position he had secured through terrifying efficiency. He trusted no one, yet he was forced to trust the one man who understood the labyrinth he had built. That man was Arthur Silas Petrov. Silas was the anti-Ricca. Where Ricca was loud, Silas was quiet. Where Ricca used a baseball bat, Silas used a fountain pen. In the smoky back room of the ambassador's lounge, Ricca's base of operations, Silas was a spectre. He sat at a small, clean desk in the corner, the only man allowed to be present for every meeting, his pen scratching against the heavy paper of his ledgers, translating screams, threats, and backroom deals into neat columns of black ink. He was the confessor for an empire of sin, and he recorded every last whisper. The other capos and soldiers barely saw him. He was furniture, he was a tool, and in that, the Quarry had made the most profound mistake of his life. He forgot that the quietest man in the room is always the most dangerous. The ambassador's lounge was Tony Ricca's cathedral. It wasn't a lavish place. The real money, Silas knew, was never spent on velvet ropes or crystal chandeliers. It was spent on silence, on loyalty, on insulation. The lounge, tucked behind a failing butcher shop in the patch, smelled of stale cigar smoke, spilled rye whiskey, and something metallic and cold, like old blood in the floorboards. The air was thick and heavy, and laughter was rare. Men spoke in low, respectful murmurs, their eyes always darting to the big man in the back booth. Tony Ricca was built like the refrigerators in the butcher shop out front. He was a man of enormous appetites and terrifyingly sudden stillness. He could be laughing, a booming, infectious sound, and in a fraction of a second, his eyes would go flat and dead. That was the Quarry. It was in that stillness that men's careers and their lives ended. Silas Petrov, by contrast, seemed to absorb no space at all. He was thin, with pale eyes behind thick lensed glasses, and he wore the same grey suit every day. He arrived at 7 in the morning before the cleaning crew and left long after midnight, his briefcase clicking shut with a soft, definitive snick. His desk was a small oasis of order in the chaos of Ricca's world. His ledger books were bound in dark green leather. His inkwell was always full, and his pens were always clean. He was, to the rest of Ricca's crew, a strange and vaguely unsettling creature. They didn't understand his power. They saw a bookkeeper. Ricca, in his own brutish way, saw a wizard. Silas didn't just count the money, he made it clean. He was the architect of the outfit's legitimate face, the complex scaffolding of shell companies, real estate holdings, and union funds that hid the raw, bloody cash flowing in from gambling, extortion, and narcotics. He could make a $100,000 payoff from a terrified union boss look like a dividend from a vending machine conglomerate in Milwaukee. One Tuesday night, Silas witnessed the true nature of the Quarry's power. A young soldier named Paulie, new to the crew and eager to impress, had been running a protection racket in a new neighborhood. He'd been asked to collect $5,000. He'd come back with $4,500. He'd explained, his voice shaking, that the business owner had cried that his wife was sick. Paulie, in a moment of disastrous pity, had let him keep $500 for the doctor. Silas didn't even look up from his ledger. He heard Ricca's chair scrape back. He heard the heavy, measured footsteps. He heard the Quarry's voice, not angry, but soft, almost paternal. "Paulie, come here." The young man stepped forward. Ricca put a heavy arm around his shoulder. "You got a big heart, kid, that's good. A man should have a heart." He squeezed Paulie's shoulder. "But your heart, it's in the wrong place. It's in your head. Say it's making you stupid." He walked Paulie to the back door, which led to the alley. "Bruno," Ricca called. His chief enforcer, a man who looked like he'd been carved from concrete, emerged from the shadows. "Take Paulie to the doctor. Show him how we pay for our own." Paulie's sharp intake of breath was the last sound he made in the lounge. Silas's pen never stopped moving. He simply made a notation in a separate book, a $4,500 deficit and a name to be removed from the weekly payroll. This was the world he lived in, a world of precise numbers and imprecise, brutal endings. He knew with mathematical certainty that his own proximity to this power was a razor's edge. He wasn't just an accountant. He was the only man alive who knew where every single body was buried, because he was the one who had to stop paying them. Silas Petrov had no family, he had no friends. He had only his work and the quiet, crushing weight of what he knew. His life was a sterile landscape of furnished rooms and solitary meals. He was a ghost long before he vanished, but there was one variable in his equation that he could not control, one person who saw the man behind the spectacles. Her name was Ilara. She was not part of the outfit, not truly. She was the widow of a man named Marco, a tailor who had once been a partner in one of Ricca's earliest legitimate businesses, a high-end suit shop that laundered money. Marco, it was said, had a conscience. He'd wanted out. One day he simply hadn't come home from work. The official story was that he'd run off with another woman, abandoning his wife and his debts. Ricca, in a rare display of public generosity, had forgiven the debts and given Ilara a job as the shop's new bookkeeper. It was a cage disguised as kindness. Ilara was trapped. She was beautiful, with a quiet, sad dignity that set her apart from the brassy women who clung to Ricca's soldiers. She was intelligent, and she knew, just as Silas did, what had really happened to her husband. She was a hostage, a lovely piece of property Ricca kept to remind everyone that he owned everything, even a person's grief. Silas saw her once a week. He would go to the tailor shop, ostensibly to audit the books. For an hour they would sit in the small, cramped office, the smell of wool and chalk in the air, the sound of the sewing machines humming in the next room. They rarely spoke of anything but the numbers, but in the silence a desperate understanding formed. He saw the way her hands trembled slightly when she poured him a cup of coffee. She saw the way his eyes, so flat and cold in the ambassador's lounge, would soften for a fraction of a second when he looked at her. They were two prisoners, trapped in the same fortress. Their connection was built on shared glances, on the careful way he'd correct a mistake in her ledger that might have drawn Ricca's ire, on the single time she'd quietly placed her hand over his on the desk and said, "Be careful, Arthur. The Quarry doesn't just break stones, he grinds them to dust." That single touch, that one use of his real name, had sealed his fate. It was a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. It was a complication he could not afford, and one he now could not live without. He wasn't just managing books anymore. He was managing a risk that was purely emotional. He saw in Ilara the life he might have had, and he saw in himself the only man who could possibly get her out. But stealing a person from Tony Ricca was a death sentence. To do it, he would need more than money. He would need a weapon so powerful it could destroy the Quarry from the inside out. And he knew, buried deep in the green leather volumes, exactly where to find it. The weapon was not a gun or a bomb. It was a ledger. Not the official ledgers that Silas presented at the weekly meetings, the ones that were themselves a work of fiction designed to be clean. It was a second set of books, a ghost ledger that Silas had been ordered to keep by the Quarry himself. This book was Ricca's ultimate insurance policy and his ultimate betrayal. It was a meticulous, line-by-line record of the money Tony Ricca was skimming from his own bosses. Ricca was a powerhouse in Chicago, but he still answered to the Commission, the shadowy board of directors that governed all of organized crime in America. He was expected to send a significant percentage of his earnings back to New York, to the families that had first staked his claim. Ricca, in his arrogance, was shorting them. He was stealing from the kings. The ghost ledger was a masterpiece of paranoia. It was written entirely in a code of Silas's own design, a cipher based on obscure bookkeeping texts from the 17th century. Only two men on earth could read it, Silas, its author, and Ricca, who held the only key. The book itself was kept in a place only Ricca could access, a private fireproof safe hidden behind a false wall in the old Merchants Trust bank vault, the very bank Ricca secretly owned through a shell corporation. Silas only ever saw the book when he was brought to the vault under heavy guard to make new entries. It was Ricca's greatest secret, and Silas knew it was his only leverage. If the Commission ever saw that ledger, Tony Ricca would cease to exist. They wouldn't just kill him, they would erase him. The plan began to form in Silas's mind, not as a desperate scramble, but as a cold, complex mathematical problem. He couldn't just run with Ilara. Ricca's reach was too long. They would be found. He couldn't just kill Ricca. He was an accountant, not an assassin. He had to create a fire so large, so devastating, that in the ensuing inferno, he and Ilara could simply walk away, two wisps of smoke in a burning forest. He would not just steal the outfit's cash. He would steal the ghost ledger itself. He would orchestrate the fall of Tony Ricca, and in the chaos, he would vanish. He began his work. It started small. He created a new shell corporation based in Panama, with a name that was an anagram of his mother's maiden name. He started siphoning tiny, imperceptible amounts from 100 different accounts, a few dollars from a vending machine route, a fraction of a percent from a construction kickback. It was digital dust, too small for anyone, even Ricca, to notice. He was building a nest egg, a new life, one penny at a time. But moving the cash was the easy part. The hard part would be walking into the dragon's lair, stealing his most precious treasure, and convincing the world that the dragon had simply vanished. The execution began on the 1st of November, 1953. The city was braced for a brutal winter, the wind off the lake carrying the promise of ice. Silas felt that same chill in his bones. He was now operating on two levels. In the ambassador's lounge, he was the same meticulous, invisible automaton. He balanced the books, tracked the payroll, and nodded silently as Ricca roared about new territories. But in the slivers of time he had to himself, in the pre-dawn hours in his rented room, in the 30 seconds he was left alone while a soldier used the restroom, he was a ghost in the machine. He was moving assets. This was not a simple bank transfer. This was 1953. Moving the outfit's fortune meant moving physical bearer bonds, cashier's checks from pliable banks, and deeds to properties held in the names of men who didn't exist. Silas used the system against itself. He created a flurry of false audits. He'd tell Bruno, Ricca's enforcer, that the IRS was sniffing around the Milwaukee vending front. "We need to move the bearer bonds to the Delaware holding company," he'd say, his voice flat, bored. "It's a standard reallocation of assets to minimize tax exposure." Bruno, who only understood the concepts of hit and collect, would just grunt, sign the transfer papers, and have the bonds moved to a new vault. But the Delaware company was a shell, which forwarded to another shell in Miami, which ultimately fed the Panamanian account only Silas controlled. He was draining the empire from the inside, using the organization's own muscle as his delivery boys. The tension was suffocating. Every time Ricca looked at him, Silas felt a cold dread. The Quarry would sit in his booth, nursing a glass of rye, and just stare at Silas while he worked. He wasn't suspicious. Not yet. He was just looking, like a biologist studying a curious insect. "Silas," he'd grumble, his voice a low rumble. "You're a good boy, Silas. You're clean. You're simple. I like that." Silas would just nod. "Thank you, Mr. Ricca." Inside, His heart was hammering against his ribs. He was living on a knife's edge. He knew that simple was the only thing keeping him alive. If Ricca ever suspected he was capable of a complex thought, of ambition, of betrayal, Silas would be just another name to be removed from the payroll. One afternoon, Ricca called him over. "Sit." Silas sat. Ricca leaned in, his breath smelling of whiskey and cloves. "They say a man who's good with numbers has no balls. They say he's a mouse. But you're surrounded by wolves all day, Silas, and you don't even flinch. You just... Right." He tapped the ledger. "Tell me, what do you think of all this? This... family?" Silas adjusted his glasses. He looked Ricca directly in the eye, his own gaze as empty as a winter sky. "I think, Mr. Ricca, that your margins on the West Side gambling dens are excellent, but your overhead on waste disposal is cutting into your profits." Ricca stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, and then burst into that booming, terrifying laugh. "Overhead on waste disposal. You hear that, Bruno? He thinks Paulie was overhead." He clapped Silas on the back, a blow that nearly sent him from the chair. "Get back to work, you little adding machine. You're a miracle." Silas walked back to his desk, his legs weak. He had passed the test, but he knew with chilling certainty that he was running out of time. The first tremor hit in the third week of November. It wasn't Silas's phantom transfers. They were too small, too deep. It was a physical collection. A bagman, a trusted capo named Frankie the Chin, was supposed to deliver $60,000 from the Longshoremen's Union. He never arrived. The next day, his car was found empty by the Calumet River, the doors wide open. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no money. The ambassador's lounge was plunged into a tomb-like silence. Tony Ricca was not angry. He was calm. And that, Silas knew, was infinitely more dangerous. Ricca's empire was built on the absolute certainty of his power. A missing bagman was a crack in the foundation. It was a sign of disrespect. It was a challenge. "It's that bastard Moretti," Ricca growled, slamming his fist on the table. Carmine Moretti was the head of a smaller rival crew, a jackal who had long been nipping at the edges of Ricca's territory. "He thinks I'm getting slow. He thinks he can just take what's mine." Bruno, the enforcer, stood by the wall, his arms crossed. "You want me to take care of it, boss?" Ricca shook his head. "No, not yet. A public hit is messy. It's war. This was quiet. It was an inside job." His eyes, cold and dark, swept the room. They passed over the soldiers, the capos, and finally, they landed on Silas. "Someone," Ricca said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "someone in this family is a rat. Someone is talking to Moretti. Someone is helping him." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. This was an unforeseen complication. He had no doubt that Moretti was responsible for the robbery, sensing a weakness. But Ricca's paranoia, now fully ignited, was no longer focused outward. It was focused inward. He was looking for a traitor. "Bruno," Ricca commanded, "find him. I don't care what it takes. Turn this place upside down. I want the books. I want the phone records. I want to know who's been eating at Moretti's restaurant, who's been talking to his cousins, who's been..." He paused. "Bruno, check the books. Check all the books." Bruno nodded, and his flat, pitiless gaze turned towards Silas's desk. The investigation had begun, and the chief investigator was a man who couldn't be fooled by complex math because he didn't understand it. Bruno only understood loyalty and betrayal. He would be looking not for numerical errors, but for any sign of deviation, any hint of a secret. Silas's meticulous plan of a slow, invisible drain was about to be exposed by a simple, brutish audit. Silas was trapped. Bruno was a blunt instrument, but he was a thorough one. He wouldn't understand the complex web of shell corporations, but he would see the anomalies. He would see the transfer authorizations, the lines of credit moved, the assets reallocated. And when he couldn't understand them, he wouldn't ask questions. He would bring Silas to Ricca, and Ricca would demand answers. The clock was no longer ticking, it was screaming. Silas had days, perhaps hours, before his methodical theft was discovered. He couldn't accelerate his plan. It was too delicate. He had to misdirect the investigation. He had to give Bruno the rat he was looking for, and it had to be someone credible. There was a capo in Ricca's organization named Sal. He was ambitious, flashy, and openly chafed under Ricca's thumb. He was also, as Silas knew from the ledgers, skimming a small amount from the construction kickbacks. It was amateurish, sloppy, and just the kind of betrayal Ricca was expecting. Silas knew that feeding Sal to the wolves was a monstrous act. It was signing a man's death warrant. But as he sat at his desk, the sound of Bruno's men tearing apart the office next door, he looked across the room at the door. He thought of Ilara. He thought of the feel of her hand on his. The equation was brutal, but simple. It was Sal's life, or his and Ilara's. He made his choice. He had to be flawless. He couldn't just tell Bruno. He had to create a trail of evidence that Bruno could discover himself. That night, working by the dim light of his desk lamp, Silas performed a different kind of accounting. He forged a new ledger page, one that detailed Sal's skimming, but amplified it. He made it look like Sal wasn't just stealing, but that he was funneling the money to a holding company. He then created a fake bank statement for that holding company, and on the list of expenditures, he added a single line: a $10,000 consulting fee paid to a restaurant owned by Carmine Moretti's brother-in-law. It was the proof of the alliance. The next morning, Silas accidentally left the forged statement tucked inside the wrong ledger, one he knew Bruno was scheduled to review. He then went to the tailor shop to see Ilara, his stomach in knots. He had to warn her. "Something is happening," he whispered to her in the back office. "Ricca is looking for a traitor. It's going to get loud. Be ready. Keep a bag packed. We are leaving. Soon?" Ilara just looked at him, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. "Arthur," she said, "there is no leaving. There is only running." Before he could reply, the bell on the shop door jingled. Two of Bruno's men walked in. They didn't look at Silas, they looked at Ilara. "The boss wants to see you," one of them said. Silas's blood turned to ice. This wasn't about the audit. This was something else. This was a new, horrifying development. It was a nightmare. The invitation for Ilara wasn't an interrogation. It was a promotion. Silas watched, helpless, as Bruno's men escorted her out. He raced back to the ambassador's lounge, his mind reeling. He found Ricca in his usual booth, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Silas, my boy, you look pale." Ricca gestured to the empty seat opposite him. "Don't worry, I'm just taking precautions." He lit a cigar, the smoke clouding his face. "This business with Frankie the Chin and the evidence you so helpfully organized for Bruno, it's got me thinking. This whole family's gotten sloppy, soft." He was referring to the forged evidence against Sal. Bruno had found it, just as planned. That night, Sal the Rat was taken for his own ride. The immediate threat to Silas was gone, but it had been replaced by something far worse. "In times of war," Ricca continued, his voice a low growl, "a man protects his most valuable assets. He brings them close, where he can see them, make sure they're safe." Silas felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew what was coming. "You, Silas, you're my brain. You're coming with me. I'm moving you into the mansion. You'll work from my study, full time, where I can keep an eye on you." A move to the mansion, a gilded cage. Silas would be watched 24/7. His plan to vanish was finished. And then Ricca delivered the final, devastating blow. And that sweet little widow, Ilara, such a sad, lonely woman. "I've been worried about her. With rats running around, who knows what could happen?" He smiled, a cold, predatory grimace. "So I'm doing her a favor. I'm moving her into the main house, too, to help with the housekeeping, keep her safe, under my personal protection." Silas's world collapsed. He had to force the air into his lungs. He had to keep his face a mask of neutral obedience. He nodded. "A wise precaution, Mr. Ricca." Ilara wasn't being protected. She was being taken hostage. Ricca, in his paranoid genius, had sensed the one thing in the world Silas cared about. He may not have known what Silas was planning, but he knew that Ilara was his leverage. She was the shackle. Silas's intricate, delicate plan to liberate himself and Ilara, to drain the accounts and disappear into the night, was utterly shattered. He was a prisoner. She was a prisoner. He had framed one man for a crime he didn't commit, only to have the woman he loved trapped by the real monster. All was lost. He was trapped in the dragon's lair, and the dragon was now holding the only thing he loved. For 3 days, Silas was a ghost in Ricca's opulent, suffocating mansion. The house was a fortress of bad taste, all marble floors, heavy velvet curtains, and gilded furniture, guarded by a rotating crew of Bruno's men. Silas worked from a magnificent mahogany desk in Ricca's study, the door always open, a guard always standing just outside. He was a prisoner with a paycheck. He saw Ilara only in glimpses. She would be polishing silver or arranging flowers, always with a silent, stone-faced housekeeper, another of Bruno's relatives, at her side. Her eyes were hollow. They looked at him, but through him. They were broken. The hope he had given her was gone, replaced by a terrifying, empty resignation. He was suffocating. His escape plan was impossible. The accounts he'd so carefully built in Panama were useless. He couldn't access them, and even if he could, he would never leave without her. His meticulous, patient plan had failed. Patience was no longer an option. He needed a new plan. He needed dynamite. He looked at the ledger on his desk. The clean ledger. It was a lie. The ghost ledger hidden in the bank vault. That was the truth. He had planned to steal it, to use it as a bargaining chip for his and Ilara's freedom. But that was a mouse's plan. A plan for a man who wanted to run. He was no longer a mouse. He was a man with nothing left to lose. He would not steal the ledger. He would use it. He would not just escape Ricca. He would destroy him. He would burn the entire empire to the ground. And in the ashes, he and Ilara would walk away, or they would die together. The new plan was desperate. It was suicide. But it was the only move left on the board. He had to get the ghost ledger. He had to get it out of the merchant's trust vault, a place Ricca himself only visited once a month. And he had to find a way to get it into the hands of the only people on Earth Ricca truly feared, the Commission. This was no longer a theft. It was a declaration of war. He would have to betray Ricca, not for money, but for justice. He began to study the guard rotations. He listened to the phone calls Ricca made in the study. He was no longer just an accountant. He was a spy. He learned that Ricca was scheduled for his monthly commission payment meeting in 2 days. He would be leaving the city, heading to a neutral site in Milwaukee to deliver his tribute. That was his window. 2 days to forge a key, bypass his own guards, steal the truth and set the city on fire. The plan's first step was impossible. He had to get out of the mansion. He was watched every second, but his captors still saw him as Silas the Mouse. They watched him, but they didn't see him. He'd spent the last 24 hours observing the night shift. The guard outside his study, a young thug named Leo, was lazy. At 3:15 a.m. every night, he would leave his post for precisely 5 minutes to steal a piece of pie from the kitchen and flirt with the nightmaid. 5 minutes. It wasn't enough to escape, but it was enough to make a phone call. Silas had to get a message to the Commission, but he couldn't call them directly. He had to contact a cutout, an intermediary. He thought back, his mind racing through years of ledger entries. He remembered a specific recurring payment, a retainer to a rare coin shop downtown. The shop was run by an old German, a man who dealt in secrets as much as currency. Ricca used him to pass messages. Silas would do the same. At 3:14 a.m., Silas sat at his desk, his heart pounding. He heard Leo's footsteps retreat down the hall. He lifted the heavy receiver of Ricca's private line. He dialed. The phone rang 3 times. A gravelly voice answered. "We are closed." Silas's voice was a dry whisper. "I am inquiring about the 1844 Prussian thaler, the one with the flaw in the eagle's eye." It was a code he'd heard Ricca use. There was a long silence. "Who is this?" Silas replied, "I am the man who counts the thalers." Another pause, heavier this time. "The flaw," the old man said, "is not a flaw. It is a mark of authenticity. What is your message?" Silas spoke quickly, his words precise. "Tell the New York partners that the Chicago house is structurally unsound. The foundation is cracked. The owner has built a private cellar and is filling it with their share of the wine." He gave the old man a date, a time, and a location. The alley behind the Merchants Trust Bank in 48 hours. A full inspection report will be available for pickup. Tell them, Tony Ricca's personal account book. He hung up before the man could reply. He was back at his desk, his breathing shallow when Leo returned, wiping crumbs from his mouth. The first domino had been pushed. The Commission was alerted. Now he had to get the ledger. That meant getting into the vault. Only Ricca had the key. But Silas, the man of details, knew something Ricca had forgotten. A copy of the vault key, along with keys to all of Ricca's other safe locations, was kept in a small weighted box, hidden inside the study's grand, non-functional fireplace, behind a loose brick. Ricca, in his arrogance, had even shown him once. Insurance, he'd called it. Silas just had to get it. He'd have to wait until Ricca left for Milwaukee. The moment the Quarry left the mansion, the house would relax. That would be his moment. He would retrieve the key, slip out during the guard change, get to the bank and retrieve the ledger. Then he would meet the commission's men. It was a suicidal, one-way trip. But as he thought of Ilara, locked in her own room upstairs, he knew he had no other choice. The morning of Ricca's departure was thick with tension. The Quarry was in a foul mood, barking orders, his paranoia at a fever pitch. He was taking a heavy crew to Milwaukee, including his top enforcer, Bruno. He stopped at the study door, his overcoat on, his hat in his hand. He stared at Silas. "You?" Silas looked up. "Yes, Mr. Ricca." Ricca walked to the desk, his presence sucking the air from the room. He leaned in close. "You're a smart boy, Silas. You're my smart boy. When I get back, you and me, we're going to have a long talk. We're going to go over everything, line by line." It wasn't a request. It was a threat. Ricca knew something was wrong. He didn't know what, but his animal instincts were screaming. He gave Silas a hard, appraising look, as if trying to memorize his face, then turned and was gone. The front door slammed, and the house seemed to exhale. Silas waited. He waited for 2 agonizing hours, his pen moving across the ledger in meaningless circles. He needed the house to settle. He needed the remaining guards to fall into the lazy rhythm of a boss-free environment. Finally, he heard the guard in the hall accept a sandwich from the kitchen. He moved. With the silence of his namesake, he slid from his chair to the fireplace. His fingers found the loose brick. It scraped, agonizingly loud in the quiet room. He reached inside. His hand closed around the cold, heavy steel of the keybox. He opened it. Inside lay a half-dozen keys. He knew the one he needed, a heavy, ornate brass key, stamped with the merchant's trust eagle. He pocketed it and slid the box back, replacing the brick. He was halfway to the gallows. Now for Ilara. He couldn't leave her. He slipped out of the study. The guard was munching on his sandwich, his back to the door. Silas moved up the grand staircase, his shoes silent on the thick carpet. He knew her room. It was in the guest wing, the same wing where he was supposed to be staying. A single, low-level guard sat on a chair at the end of the hall. He was reading a racing form. Silas didn't hesitate. He walked directly toward him. The guard looked up, surprised. "Hey, you ain't supposed to..." Silas didn't stop. He held up his hand, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Mr. Ricca," he said, his voice clipped and authoritative. "Forgot his Milwaukee statements. He's furious. He needs the profit-loss summary from the tailor shop. Mrs. Marco has the duplicate." The guard, accustomed to Silas being an extension of Ricca's will, hesitated. He was paid to keep people from leaving, not from moving between rooms. Okay, but be quick." He unlocked Ilara's door and pushed it open. Silas stepped inside. Ilara was sitting on the bed, her face pale. The guard stood in the doorway. "Get the papers," Silas ordered her, his voice cold. He turned to the guard. "And could you get me a glass of water? My throat is dry from Mr. Ricca's yelling." The guard, annoyed but compliant, grunted and shuffled off toward the main stairs. The second he was out of sight, Silas grabbed Ilara's hand. "Not a word. We have 60 seconds. Go to the kitchen service exit. Wait for me in the alley. If I am not there in 15 minutes, run. Do not stop. Go to the train station. There is a locker. The combination is your husband's birthday. There is money. Go." Ilara was trembling. "Arthur, what?" "Go," he hissed. She fled down the back stairs. Silas walked calmly out of the room, leaving the door open, and headed not for the kitchen but for the front door. Silas walked out the front door of Tony Ricca's mansion as if he owned it. The guards at the gate, new men who barely knew him by sight, saw a thin man in a grey suit carrying a briefcase. He nodded at them, his face a mask of bored purpose. "Mr. Ricca needs the First National deposit slips. He's waiting at the bank." The guards, their boss hours away in Milwaukee, simply waved him through. It was the arrogance of the invisible. He was the accountant. He was furniture, and he had just walked out of his cage. He didn't run. He walked at a steady, measured pace to the bus stop. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every passing car seemed to slow. He boarded the bus, paid his fare, and sat, his briefcase on his lap. He was just a bookkeeper on his way to work. He got off 3 blocks from the Merchants' Trust. The alley was cold and dark, smelling of wet garbage and the river. He checked his watch. 4:15 p.m. The drop was scheduled for 5 UL p.m. He had to be in and out. He used the brass key on the bank's rear service entrance. It opened with a well-oiled click. The bank was closed to the public, but the building was not empty. He knew the layout. He avoided the main floor and took the stairs to the basement, to the vault. It stood at the end of a concrete corridor, a massive circular steel door. He used the same key and then spun the heavy combination lock. The tumblers clicked. He pulled the massive handle and the door hissed open. The air inside was stale, cold. He stepped in. This was Ricca's Holy of Holies. Safety deposit boxes lined one wall, on the other, a row of filing cabinets, and in the back, the small fireproof safe where the ghost ledger was kept. He used a third, smaller key from the box. He opened the safe, and there it was, a single dark red leather-bound book. He took it, his hands shaking for the first time. He had it. He had the truth. He placed it in his own briefcase, locking it. He was about to turn and leave when a sound echoed from the corridor. A heavy footstep. Silas froze. He wasn't supposed to be here. Ricca was in Milwaukee. The vault door, which he had left open, swung shut with a terrifying final thud. A heavy bar dropped on the outside. He was locked in. A low, familiar voice came from the other side of the steel. "Hello, Silas." It wasn't Ricca. It was Bruno, the enforcer. He had never gone to Milwaukee. He had been waiting. The boss. He's a smart man. He told me, "If that little mouse ever stops looking scared, it means he's found a trap." You stopped looking scared this morning, Silas. The boss wants his book back, and he wants you to be filed away. Silas was in a tomb. The air was already growing thin. The official story was written by the victors, as it always is. The day after Tony Ricca's meeting in Milwaukee, the Chicago newspapers ran a small story. A prominent, if reclusive, businessman named Anthony Ricca had reportedly taken an extended vacation to Italy. His associates claimed he had retired, but the men in the ambassador's lounge knew the truth. Ricca had walked into that meeting, but he had never walked out. The commission, armed with the evidence of his betrayal, had simply erased him. His empire was fractured overnight, carved up by his rivals and the commission's chosen successors. The reign of the Quarry was over, not with a bang, but with a quiet final deletion from the ledger of the living. The whispers in the street told another, more romantic tale. They spoke of the quiet accountant, the mousy little man who had played the most dangerous game of all and won. The legend of Silas Petrov grew. He was the man who had stolen millions from the outfit, turned the bosses against each other and vanished like smoke. They said he'd gotten away with it all, the money, the power, and the beautiful widow. He became a folk hero, a testament to the idea that the brain could just once beat the brawn. In the smoky bars and back alleys, men would raise a glass to Silas the Ghost, the bookkeeper who had pulled the ultimate disappearing act. And for decades, that was where the story ended. A perfect unsolved mystery. A man, a woman, and a fortune lost to the wind. This version of events was clean. It was hopeful. It gave a sense of order to a chaotic world. But the shadows of Chicago's Gothic past do not give up their secrets so easily. The story of Silas and Ilara, of the vanishing and the fortune, was not one of simple escape. It was a story of a price paid in full. The romantic legend of the couple living out their days on a warm, distant beach was the greatest illusion Silas had ever crafted. The truth was far darker, and it remained buried, waiting in the cold, wet silence beneath the city for the world to forget. The truth did not involve a clean getaway. It involved a final, horrific sacrifice and a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. Let us return to that flooded vault, to the year 2004. The demolition crew, the police, and the forensic anthropologists stood in the muddy water, staring at the skeleton chained to the empty briefcase. The city was electrified. They had found the legendary Silas Petrov. The gold filling was the final clue. The case was closed. But as the forensics team began their work, the story began to unravel in a new and far more disturbing way. The first anomaly was the height. The skeleton was tall, over 6 feet. Arthur Petrov, according F to his 1942 draft card, was 5'7". The second was the evidence of healed fractures on the ribs and knuckles, consistent with a life of brutal violence, not meticulous bookkeeping. The final piece of the puzzle came from a DNA test, compared against a distant living relative found in city records. The skeleton in the vault, the man chained to the briefcase. It was not Arthur Silas Petrov. It was Bruno, Ricca's chief enforcer. The story snapped into a new, terrifying focus. Silas's plan had not been a desperate scramble. It had been a cold, surgical masterpiece of revenge. He knew Ricca was setting a trap. He knew Bruno was waiting for him. He had orchestrated the entire confrontation. When he walked into that vault, he wasn't alone. He had been escorted by the Commission's men, the ones he had summoned, the men who were waiting in the alley. It wasn't a trap for Silas. It was a trap for Bruno. Silas, protected by the Commission's soldiers, had confronted the enforcer. He had handed the real ghost ledger to the Commission, sealing Ricca's fate. Then, as his final act, he had turned to Bruno, the man who had terrorized him, the man who had held Ilara captive. And he had passed judgment. They'd chained Bruno to a fake briefcase in the vault, a decoy for a mystery he knew the city would one day need to solve. They had welded the door shut, leaving him to his fate in the dark. Silas had not just destroyed the quarry, he had buried his most loyal soldier alive, creating the perfect scapegoat for his own disappearance. He had framed Bruno for his own vanishing. But this leaves us with one last, haunting question. The legend says Silas and Ilara escaped together, but the Commission is not known for its sentimentality. They do not leave loose ends. They would never trust the man who had so perfectly betrayed one boss not to betray another. The truth is, Silas Petrov vanished that day. He was taken by the Commission, his purpose served. And Ilara? She was last seen at the train station, waiting for a man who would never arrive. So if the body in the vault was Bruno, and Silas was taken by the mob, who was the man with the gold filling, the dental records, and they were a perfect match? For Sila's missing husband, Marco, the tailor, the first man Ricca had made disappear. Silas hadn't just gotten revenge, he had solved a murder, and then used the truth as his final brilliant misdirection. The real question then is not how Silas vanished, but just how many ghosts he created before he did.